Austin Doctor is the head of Counterterrorism Research Initiatives, National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center. He actually has one business card, but he holds two together to get the entire title on there, at the University of Nebraska. Austin's parents probably had great hopes for him as he went off to the University of Georgia. Maybe he could become a lawyer and be Austin Doctor Esquire, but instead he insisted on getting a PhD, so he's just Dr. Doctor, which is probably something he's heard before. But he's also the guy who is writing forward-looking stuff on radicalization and how it shifts, but also taking on the more complex issues, which is looking back on, as people like you consider, where's the next threat? It's like, what are we going to do with the thousands of refugee families in these camps who are sweltering there and becoming more radicalized? Or what do we do with the foreign fighters by the hundreds that are in different countries where their home countries won't take them back, and somebody has to figure out, where do we put them? Do we bring them to trial? Do we cast them out? And if we do they return to ISIS-K? These are complex and important issues. So welcome, Dr. Doctor.
Okay, good afternoon. First, thank you so much to Ali, to Colin, to the Sufan team for hosting this important meeting. It's rare to see this many thought, policy, and action leaders together in one space, and I know that we've all been inspired by the testimonies and the insights that we've heard over the past few days. In that same spirit, over the next 45 minutes, we get to hear from a panel of experts whose work has deeply shaped the way that we understand how terrorists harness the power of emerging technologies. Before we get to that panel, you have to deal with me. I was asked to provide some high-level comments to frame this important discussion, and I'd like to use this brief time to address what I think is a basic but foundational question, and that is, why should we be having this conversation, and why now? I work at Insight. As the federally designated Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism Studies, our team is grappling with this exact problem set on a daily basis. And I think that our work offers some answers to this fundamental question. So that's really where we're headed for the next couple of minutes. 3 reasons why we as a community need to be discussing how terrorists exploit emerging tech. Reason number 1, we see clear intent across the violent extremist ecosystem to exploit emerging technology. I think we can take one look at our news feeds, the recent string of DOJ-led charges, incidents abroad, whether it be racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, homegrown violent extremists, and FTOs, is becoming clear that terrorists of all stripes are keen to innovate. They are adopting creative means of creating harm and disruption. This isn't a futurist projection. This is something that's happening now. These terrorists are seeking new ways to advance their causes through new forms of violence. Reason number 2 is that emerging technologies stand to bolster terrorist capabilities. We're seeing technologies integrated into various stages of the radicalization, mobilization, and attack cycles, whether it be drones, unmanned systems being used to deliver explosives, or AI being used to streamline propaganda and radicalization efforts. The general democratization of sophisticated technology reduces barriers both for skilled and for unskilled users. And this is problematic as key technologies become more accessible. They are ready to use out of the box, and they are more cost affordable. Reason number 3 is that the underlying purpose of this creativity is to carve out new opportunities for lethal disruption. Whether we're talking about unmanned systems, in robotics, artificial intelligence and machine learning, the metaverse or extended reality, the Internet of Things, additive manufacturing, many of these stand to open new pathways to circumventing existing security measures and protocols. They provide grounds for tactical surprise, and they expose new targets and vulnerabilities. Now, like so many other dimensions of today's terrorism landscape, the exploitation of emerging tech isn't a substitution, it's not a replacement of the old threat picture, it's an addition to it. Don Rassler, who we're all going to hear from in just a moment, has argued elsewhere and written that we were in, quote, the compound era of U.S. counterterrorism. And I think that frame is spot on. Malign use of tech is a great example where it is adding weight to the burden that's already shouldered by the counterterrorism workforce as they are working to keep our communities safe. To conclude, and we've heard this alluded to a number of times this week, but we're looking at a threat landscape full of blinking red lights. And I would argue that even in that context, that terrorist use of emerging tech is an item that is both important and one that carries a growing urgency. But what does that mean for us? And specifically, what does this mean for us in this room today? First is that the onus is on us to stay on the forward edge of the innovation curve. I think this will require a resourced focus on identifying and understanding novel threats. It requires maintaining and holding space in policy, practice, and research for keeping one eye over the horizon. And second, and this is a little bit of a sing kumbaya moment, but I mean it with sincerity, there's really no room here for going it alone. This dynamic is emerging at a time when the counterterrorism mission community is already being asked to do more with less. This necessitates new levels of collaboration and partnership, whether it be interdisciplinary sense-making, interagency solutions, coordination across federal, state, and local levels of government, greater engagement between government, industry, and universities. It's for these reasons and others I'm encouraged to see this panel discussion happening today. I look forward to joining you in the audience and learning from this great group of next panelists. Thank you.
Which set us up perfectly for Beyond the Bright, Shiny Object, Understanding How Terrorists Harness the Power of Emerging Technologies, moderated by Ms. Naureen Chowdhury Fink, and she will be joined by Ms. Jessica Davis, visiting senior fellow at the Soufan Center, Mr. Don Rassler, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and Vidya Ramalingam, founder and CEO of Moonshot, as well as Dr. Kim Cragen, Director of the Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University. Welcome our panel.
Well, good afternoon, and let me echo my predecessors by thanking Ali and the Soufan Center for this wonderful opportunity. It's such a rare privilege to be able to stop the daily task list and actually hear from so many experts. And a huge thank you to all of you for staying with us. I'd like to think of this as, not the panel that is among the end of the conference and holding you up from the weekend, but maybe the panel that's getting your weekend started and the preface to happy hour. So thank you for being with us. I'm really delighted to be joined by these experts and to hear these perspectives. We've heard a lot over the last 2 days about social media, about emerging technologies, and I'm really excited to get down to this conversation. But I will, with the permission of my co-panelists, take just a minute to share a couple of perspectives from the organization that I head up, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism. And that's because we have been hearing a lot about the need to collaborate, the need for public-private partnerships, and the role of the private sector. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we do and a few snapshots on this topic that might help frame some of the discussion we're having today. So in case you didn't know us, GIFCT is a nonprofit organization with now 32 member companies. Some of you might remember us from about 4 years ago. We had 4 founding companies. We have now grown to an expanded 32 very diverse member companies representing very different types of technology. Our work focuses on supporting companies by fostering cross-platform information sharing, and we can get back to why that is so key, but fostering cross-platform information sharing and knowledge development by connecting our member companies to global experts and expertise, and we'll come back to that as well, why that's so important. We support collaborative crisis response, and very few folks have really talked about the role of the tech companies when we respond to incidents that are unfolding that have an online dimension. That is a key factor of what we do. And we also have a number of tech tools with which we support our 32 member companies. So GiftCT is really a very unique public-private partnership. We have governments and civil society on our advisory committee. We are a tech-led initiative, so we bring industry expertise and experience to bear. And I just wanted to share a couple of really quick reflections on the topic at hand today that I hope can help frame our discussion. The first point, and I'm running quickly because I do see the clock, but it's important to remember the online and offline relationships, and that effectively countering terrorism requires a response in both spaces. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes not so much. I hear a lot about online threats and online responses, but that relationship between the online and offline world, I think, is really key. Second, Gen AI will change a lot of things. It already has in ways that some of us don't even know. And that'll all change tomorrow when it's changed again. But it has both costs and benefits to adversarial actors. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there are also existing laws and experiences that can govern how we manage this risk. So it's not that we are always starting from scratch. The panel before us, folks like Eric Farah, talked about 20 years of counterterrorism law and practice that has evolved, certainly in the international spaces. And the discussion about Gen AI, does not come in a vacuum. It reflects some of those developments. Finally, not finally, I'd have 2 points. I lied, sorry. The evolving nature of the threat makes cross-platform collaboration and solutions essential. Just as we've seen that no single state or sector can alone really deal with a terrorist threat or develop the kinds of responses needed, so too cross-platform information sharing and collaboration with the private sector, among the private sector, and among different sectors working with them is really essential. And finally, as we heard today, and echoing what Chris Costa said about the importance of the rule of law, as in IRL, in real life counterterrorism efforts, human rights are key to credible and sustainable responses and our core GiftCT values. We work with tech companies on the meaningful implications of those principles and many of the ideas enshrined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And many of our member companies, in fact, all of our member companies, subscribe to these membership criteria and principles when they join us. So that is a very important part of how we translate many of the norms and lessons learned that all of you have developed in the counterterrorism space. It does come back and shape how we work with the private sector. So with that said, I just wanted to share a few snapshots and perspectives from our work with tech companies, and I'm now turning over to the experts, and I love this part. I get to ask the tough questions, and then they have to answer them. I don't have to do the work. So very quickly, I'll turn over to Don Rassler, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. And Don, let's kick off with this. From your perspective, have emerging technologies substantially impacted the threat landscape of terrorism and violent extremism online? And if so, how?
Thanks, Naureen. And thanks to the Soufan Center, Ali Soufan, and the whole team for putting this event together. It's really an honor to be here on this panel and to be in front of all of you, given the work that you all do. I think that the short answer to your question is, which we all already understand, is yes, absolutely. And I think that there's a strong case to be made that as we look forward, that the impacts of technology, core areas and emerging technologies is going to intensify. It's going to broaden and diversify. Before I'd sort of mention a little bit about where we see the impacts of key technologies in terms of terrorism and violent extremism, I think it's helpful to level set. And I just want to briefly outline some key technology areas where we have seen these impacts and where there is concern about its future evolution. These are all things that we know. One in particular involves your work at GSTPV in strong part, digital technologies, communication applications. If we take a broad view of that, that can include things as we look forward like metaverse environments as one core area. Another important area where there's concern is unmanned systems and how it interplays with autonomous technologies. We all have heard a lot about aerial drones, but obviously we need to be concerned about maritime and ground drones as well. A third area is 3D printing. This is an area where, and particularly 3D printed firearms, there's been some great empirical work that's been done recently that maps out far-right extremism interests in terms of producing 3D printed firearms and utilizing those type of weapons into future attacks and plots. And I think that that's an area where there's likely going to continue to be growth. Naturally, VEOs and terrorists, just like all of us, have an interest in artificial intelligence and generative AI, concerns about scale, like any business or organization. There's also concerns about things like jailbreaks. How do you navigate around different generative AI systems to sort of get some of those details like you want, like bomb planning instructions? And then the last area I would mention is decentralized finance and cryptocurrency. I know Jess is going to talk about this. Now, where are the impacts? I would offer three. The first is something that we all recognize, is that these core technology areas have really dramatically shaped the operating environment for VEOs and terrorists. We all know this. I think it's helpful to think about this in terms of a couple factors. One factor, access. The content that people have access to, the connections that they can make, and also the tradecraft. One of the core themes that's been discussed yesterday and today is the rise of youth being involved in terrorist plots, and that's where I think this access issue comes into play. Another key thing, which Austin mentioned, is just how these technology areas for all of us and our benefit of humanity, for VEOs and terrorists, it also provides them with a diversity of options for them to plot, plan, and get creative. And that's an area that I think deserves attention. The second sort of broad area I would say in terms of impact are the organizational and network impacts of technology. Flashback to 9/11, we were always concerned about a variety of different threats, but they were primarily oriented around Al-Qaeda or groups that had or embraced strong elements of organizational form. Nowadays, we have threats that all of you have to deal with and live with and investigate that exist across a spectrum of organizational forms, from the more structured to the very decentralized or centerless. We think about sort of acceleration networks that's been talked about. The third area, just to mention as a broad impact area, is that with technology, is it's really impacting tactics and methods. This involves your work at GSTPV. You mentioned the work of your partners, things like live streaming or the playbooks that are out there that are decentralized for the disconnected to plug into and associate their attack with something broader. Or we can think about it through the lens of something like drones, where we obviously are familiar with the Islamic State case, but as we look forward, some areas that we're really concerned about at CTC is how the continued reduction in barriers to entry for core technologies, capabilities to include focus on speed, scale, and range. I'll stop there, but that would be a broad overview.
We knew we'd do this. Staying on the evolving threat landscape and challenges, Jessica Davis is a senior visiting fellow at the Soufan Center and founder of Inside Threat Intel. If you haven't subscribed, you should do so, and I got no commission for saying that. Jess, are emerging technologies simply providing better tools for adversarial actors, or are they also fundamentally shaping the nature and the goals and the operations of terrorist groups? You've been following these developments in terrorist financing for some time, so how are you thinking about these intersections?
Yeah, thank you so much, Naureen. And again, thank you to the Soufan Center and to Ali Soufan for having me. It's great to be here amongst so many colleagues whose work I really draw on and meet some people for the first time. When I think about new technologies and the finance piece, I think about it as an evolution and adaptation. So very much along the lines of what Don was just talking about. it's not a sudden shift in terms of all of a sudden everybody's using cryptocurrency. It's been a slow roll for a long time. Back in 2014, I worked at our security intelligence service in Canada, if you can't tell, I'm Canadian. And at that time, everyone was asking me about cryptocurrency, what is it? So I undertook some initial work, and really what we were seeing at that time was proof of concept. So our terrorists, our subjects of investigation, were really looking at things and thinking, can I use it, doing small scale stuff, keeping it really low key. Today, 10 years later, that is no longer the case. I've been collecting data for about the last 5 or 6 years on overt methods that terrorists use to finance their activities. And for the longest time, it was banks. Banks were the #1 way the terrorists were moving money. Just last month, I ran the numbers again, and it's now cryptocurrency. They're neck and neck. Like we're still seeing a lot of traditional finance in that space, but cryptocurrency has now become one of the main ways that terrorists are moving money. When I said this on LinkedIn, all the crypto people came for me, which is always a fun experience, because I think a lot of the cryptocurrency sector doesn't want to necessarily accept that this is very much a tool for illicit actors, and there's a number of reasons why that is, which I'm happy to expand on. The thing that I think is really interesting, though, is that it's not just about shifting to one technology, it's adding it on. So when you look at a group like Hamas, they're using things like hawala, cash couriers, trade-based money movements, banks, and cryptocurrency. So for every case where I see cryptocurrency, it's in addition to it, not a shift away from other methods. One of the ways we see this is very much even in the hawala sector, and this is where things get quite interesting, I think. I was running a couple of investigations into ISIL finance about 2 years ago, really trying to understand what those networks look like. We had a pretty good understanding, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, but after the collapse of the caliphate, keeping on top of that, I think has fell by the wayside. So I was looking at these networks and looking at some of the known hawaladars who were facilitating that activity, and a number of them had actually started accepting cryptocurrency transactions. So what this meant was that people who wanted to donate money or move money into or out of the caliphate or former territories or to ISIL supporters could send a transaction to a hawaladar, and that money would get cashed out in local currency to someone. It created another break in the money trail that as an investigator can become very annoying. Hawalas are notoriously difficult to investigate, require a specific level of access, and when you add in cryptocurrency and any kind of obfuscation technology, that becomes very challenging for capable countries, let alone countries that are still receiving financial transactions to the financial intelligence units on paper. So there's a big disparity in this space in terms of capabilities as well. The last thing I want to say about crypto and new technologies is that it's not happening everywhere. Where you don't see counter-terrorist financing pressures, you tend not to see the adoption of cryptocurrency. There's a great example of this in Nigeria. Nigeria has a very well-developed crypto sector, but a lot of the groups operating in and near Nigeria are not using cryptocurrency at all or very much. They're still using things like cash and trade-based movement of money and goods and cash couriers. And part of the reason for this is because Nigeria does not have a particularly capable counter-terrorist financing system. So we see that evolution and we see that adaptation, but only when the conditions are right. The one thing that I want to conclude on is that when we have these additive components for terrorist financing, it makes the investigations longer and harder. And so while there's a few benefits to cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, new technologies, and that you have a trail that you can follow, it's digital. When we're jumping between currencies into and out of traditional finance, that becomes a very long investigation that requires a lot of different levels of access.
Thanks. We're going to switch a little and think about how emerging technologies are affecting the response. Dare I say the response landscape? Doesn't sound as sexy as threat landscape, but the response landscape. And so I'll turn to Kim Cragen, who is director of the Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University. And I'll ask you kind of the mirror question to Don. Can you speak to some of the evolving trends and new technologies for counterterrorism?
Let me just say, Jessica, that Nigeria example is really interesting. I just wanted to pile on that. And also add my obligatory thanks, but actually to Colin for being persistent in getting me here, and I really appreciate that. And then also my usual caveat that I work for the National Defense University, but I don't speak for the US government, so just throw that out there. Okay, talking about counterterrorism technologies. So for the past 3 years, I've been looking at over-the-horizon counterterrorism, and all of my studies basically have been, so how are we gonna make this work? Technology is part of the solution, but only a small part, but I'm gonna touch on 3 that I think are going to be instrumental to the extent to which we can make over-the-horizon work, and I know that's definitely up for debate and discussion. First is actually biometrics. This is not new, but as the US military pulls back and has an over-the-horizon posture, I think it's going to be more important for law enforcement and border security to be pushing forward, for there to be information sharing across partners, and biometrics is going to be instrumental in preventing the movement of terrorists around the world. The second one is alternatives to FMV, full motion video. FMV was the hero of Afghanistan and Iraq, but right now these platforms feel old and slow. And so they're just vulnerable now. General Kurilla, CENTCOM commander, has talked about this. He talks about alternative forms of ISR. He talks about disposable and digital as alternatives. The Army has its own task force, and it talks about land, air, space, and I would add cyber to that. And my biggest concern in the development of these new technologies is that they end up being reserved for great power competition and not used for counterterrorism. And so I would say, I would urge the government to continue to use them for counterterrorism. Third and finally, I think we need to continue to invest in new offensive weapons that will keep civilian casualties low to zero. So as has been mentioned, if the Ayman al-Zawahiri strike is the model for over-the-horizon counterterrorism, and I think some of us can dispute whether or not that's a good model, but if it is the model, let's talk about that tactically. This means you have an urban environment, you have a house full of civilians, and you only kill the bad guy. I think that was the term that was used earlier, the bad guy. No civilians. This is very, very hard to do. And the weapon that you would use to do this is not the same weapon that you use for war. And so this again requires investments in counterterrorism specific technologies that you wouldn't see for the broader conventional fight. I'll just leave it there.
So Vidya Ramalingam is founder and CEO of Moonshot. And I wanted to turn to you and ask if you're seeing shifts in like the online recruitment patterns or radicalization pathways, which I know you followed for some time, but also if you're seeing shifts in the application of redirective efforts that you're doing online.
Thanks, Naureen, and echoing everyone's thank you to the Soufan Center. It's such an impressive team, and they've brought together a really impressive group of people. At Moonshot, we develop technology both to identify and assess risks of violence online, but we also use technology to deliver prevention online. And we do that across the United States, here at home, but we also do this abroad in many countries around the world. And I would say in almost any context that we do this work, a critical starting point is we need to remember that radicalization online is principally fueled by people. Human relationships, and Naureen really importantly signaled the relationship between online and offline. Yes, the platforms absolutely hold responsibility. Yes, algorithmic content recommendations and other elements of platform design do significantly contribute to the radicalization process, and we can come back to that and discuss that. However, when we say that someone was radicalized online, and I heard that phrase time and time again throughout the last 2 days, the vast majority of those cases involve someone who was interacting with communities online. Communities that validate their grievances, share justifications and even tips and tricks for how to commit acts of violence, that serve as a support community for individuals who are considering violence. So while, yes, we are seeing constant shifts in the tools that get used for recruitment online, so the use of generative AI tools to create content, immersive gaming, et cetera, ultimately the most powerful recruitment tool online still remains building relationships. It's that like fundamental recruitment tool. It's that sense of belonging that someone feels when they're a part of an online community, whether or not that community is real or imagined, and sometimes it is imagined. So what does that actually mean for delivering prevention online? If peer connections are a critical part of the online radicalization process, then let's use that same tool, human relationships, peer connections, as a methodology to disrupt it. We've known in offline settings for decades now, and there's substantial evidence to show this, that behavioral health methods work in intervening with someone who's at risk of violence. Getting someone, and I'm saying this outside of the context of conflict zones, so I'm thinking about this, let's maybe talk about the US in particular, domestically. Getting someone at risk into the bounds of a one-to-one conversation with a trained specialist, a counselor, a social worker, a clinical psychologist, someone who has the skills and the qualifications to assess risk of violence and to de-escalate someone who might be presenting that risk. So to scale this, we need to be able to deliver those sorts of interventions and meet people where they are, which is online. We all live our lives online and offline. So what we do is we operate a model to connect people who are engaging with extremist and terrorist content online, to connect them with trained specialists. And our technology of choice to do that, it's actually pretty simple. It's ad tech. It's something that all major companies are using on a daily basis to get us to spend more money. Since we're in New York, I just want to give a quick example of this in practice here. As you all know, and as has been discussed throughout the last few days, in May of 2022, 10 people were killed in Buffalo, New York, in a grocery store, all black, at the hands of a white supremacist who was largely radicalized online. After that attack, the state of New York tasked Moonshot with setting up a model that would intervene in the radicalization process online. So what we did is we stood up a model to use ad tech, as I mentioned, to ensure that anyone within the state of New York who is consuming extremist content, engaging with terrorist content online, will be offered the chance to speak to a specially trained professional, someone who can de-escalate them from violence. So what does this actually involve? Starting point actually to do this work online is offline. So we trained 98 frontline service providers across the state of New York who now have the skills to assess risk of terrorism and targeted violence. And then we brought their services online. So of those 98, 32 of those providers are now prepared to receive online referrals. We're then running online advertising campaigns across multiple platforms, which are triggered by someone taking an action online, indicating support for or interest in joining or sympathy with terrorist and extremist organizations. If you take that action, you'll be presented with an ad that offers you the chance to access free and confidential services provided by a service provider who can de-escalate you from violence. In the last 15 months of operation, we've reached people consuming extremist content online across the state over 2 million times. That is 2 million times in 15 months that someone in the state of New York attempted to consume terrorist content, extremist content, or posted content that was glorifying an act of violence, glorifying terrorism, over 2 million times. And over 50 individuals have reached out to engage with a counselor, to engage with someone who can help them. These are individuals who are presenting very high risk. While we do not have information on the details of those cases, that is behind patient-client confidentiality, we do know from our counselors that the individuals coming through are individuals who are presenting very, very high risk. This is just an example of what governments can do. And the most important point I would mention here is we have to bring our offline violence prevention infrastructures online. We have to meet people where they are, which is online, and we have to reach them before they choose to pick up a gun.
Thanks, Vidya. Don, coming back to you, we've been hearing a lot about the intersections of great power competition and the work we're looking in counterterrorism. I mean, intersections, competitions, conflicts, but How do you see some of the key geopolitical dynamics that we've been talking about actually shaping the impacts and implications of the emerging technologies that we're discussing?
Yeah, I think we could have a long conversation about this topic with a long list. I would orient it around, I think, 5 key areas. And these are my views, not those of the CTC. The first that I would share is, which has been touched on in this conference as one of the themes, is just the ongoing divestment from counterterrorism. The shift in priorities to strategic competition was overdue. The cuts were overdue, and that's a healthy and good forcing function. I think what's been challenging for the counterterrorism community is that this has all taken place where the community is also expected to deal with the steady lift of, we're not taking away threats. We've heard many people talk about this. There's still the same threats that in some cases are being lifted to do more with less. And the counterterrorism enterprise is being expected to having a smaller counterterrorism airplane to sort of figure out how to optimize its flight while it's doing that. That's a really tricky thing to do. And that may require additional investments in counterterrorism, or for us to think more strategically and creatively about how to optimize and put that in practice. That's the first thing. The second area I would point to is intensified strategic competition and how that can have terrorism outputs. So if we look back to the Cold War and the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, we all know that as a lesson how states in this intensified arena have an incentive in various ways to avoid state-on-state conflict. And so asymmetric warfare and proxy conflict can become more of a thing. Now, that doesn't mean that terrorism is going to be the core element of that, but in some future conflicts that it seems likely that terrorism will be a component. I think we only need to look at Iran's behavior with some of their strategies and activity, or to look at the Russians with the Wagner Group or the Africa Corps in the African context to sort of look for examples of that. The third area I think that deserves sort of geopolitically for us to really focus on are the innovation and terrorism outputs from ongoing major conflicts. This includes the war in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine. So we have seen some of the early stage outputs from the war in Gaza. The Soufan Center, I think 2 days ago, released a report that sort of really looked at this issue, which I thought was a helpful spotlight compiling cases. But I think we're still at the early phases of what those outputs will be. I am quite concerned about the innovation outputs from Ukraine. I study terrorism. I think about how terrorists can use technology. And it is such an innovation lab, as we all recognize in Ukraine, of looking at things like drone warfare. And in particular, things like first-person view FPV drones, which are sort of, racing drones, how those have been adopted and integrated in Ukraine on both sides at scale. The deep strike, sort of longer range attacks, utilizing drones that the Ukrainians have been able to do. Just as Russian and Ukrainian actors have been able to learn from the Islamic State, it seems predictable that threat networks on the VEO side are also looking at these conflicts and saying, how do I integrate or utilize an FPV drone in an operation? Fourth example or area that I think deserves focus, which has been touched on in this conference, is the ongoing dehumanization of political opponents. We see that in this country. We see that in a lot of different contexts around the globe, and how there is quite an issue with political violence on different sides of the political spectrum, even here, is more embraced as a method to affect change. I think that's a pretty scary thing. Lastly, are other stressors that we can think about, economic, but I would like to spotlight climate change and the competition for scarce resources. I think that's also sort of early days on the terrorism side, but I think as that threat area evolves, as this becomes more intensified, I think technology is going to be a core component of that threat too.
Well, I'm definitely not going to rest easy tonight. Thank you for that list. Jess, you've worked a lot on sanctions, and the sanctions regimes in many countries follow the perceptions of risks and threats, right? And individuals and groups that pose the greatest concern. How do you see sanctions regimes and policies sort of informing or shaping responses online or among the tech sector?
There are two really interesting examples that we could point to over the last couple of months and weeks and years. The first one is the sanctioning of a cryptocurrency mixer, which is an anonymizer meant to make cryptocurrency transactions more anonymous. This is a tool that the US actually said, we're not going to allow access to this. Anybody who uses it, of course, can be prosecuted for that. In and of itself, that doesn't change people's access to it, but it does mean that if there's an ongoing investigation and you're found to be using that, law enforcement has another tool that they can bring against them. The second one, of course, is the designation of Telegram, which is a really interesting move away from, I wouldn't necessarily even call it a group, but like more of a platform. And so sanctioning that entity. The last one is something that's more on the emerging side that I want to talk about, which is the issue around particular cryptocurrencies. There's one that's called Tether. I won't bore you with the details, but it's a US dollar pegged cryptocurrency. It's very popular with terrorists and other illicit actors because of that peg, which means that it's stable. So if you're ever transacting in Bitcoin, you don't want to do that because it's volatile and you lose money all the time. And the transaction fees are really low. So it's very popular for illicit actors. This has gotten a lot of bad press lately. And what we saw even, I think it was just this week, was a consortium of private sector actors working together to try to make that network more secure. So we've got a blockchain analytics company and Tether and the network itself working together to try to root out those illicit actors, probably to try to prevent it from getting sanctioned by countries.
Thank you. Vidya, Kim, you're both talked about experiences in research and sort of practice, and I wondered if you have any recommendations for industry and governments or any lessons learned from the experiences that you've been talking about and some of the adaptations.
I'll start and then hand over. Great. I don't want to let the tech companies off the hook here. So I mentioned earlier, governments have a responsibility to bring their offline prevention infrastructure online. Platforms also hold responsibility here, specifically to build safety into the platforms. And there's a few good examples of where platforms have really advanced in the last 5 years how they do this. They are increasingly taking inspiration from what works offline. So an example, since 2018, we have worked with Meta to build into Facebook's infrastructure and also Instagram a possibility that if you are searching for terrorist content on the platform, that if you are in a country where this is live, that you will be prompted, instead of receiving that terrorist content, you'll be prompted with a signpost to an organization that provides de-escalation services, so very similar to the model that I mentioned to you earlier. Now that's all well and good, but consider what this means in an era of generative AI and where those tools are publicly available. And since last year, we started working with several Gen AI companies to test some of the most used Gen AI chatbots. I'm not going to mention the actual chatbot names, but I think you can probably guess some of the most used ones across the globe. We did red teaming of 3 of those. And we tested how many leaps it would take on the platform for the platform to actually recommend violent content. We found serious weaknesses in all 3, very, very problematic results. Within 1 or 2 prompts, every single one of those chatbots, you could get the chatbot to tell you the pros of remaining in a violent extremist organization, to teach you how to create convincing disinformation, including specific headlines to use, the text, the imagery, how to contact violent extremist groups, instructions on who to reach. We found encouragements to take your own life, and then we even found step-by-step instructions on how to successfully carry out terrorist attacks and how to do so with the most casualties. Those are on many of the generative AI chatbots that many of you in the room might be using. So step 1 for industry in an era of generative AI is, number 1, before the release of new large language models, industry needs to be building in robust, tested safeguards to prevent them from actually producing and encouraging violence within the platform. But then secondly, we actually need to use Gen AI as an opportunity for positive interventions to actually start redirecting people towards services when they are seeking to abuse those sorts of tools.
I think a lot of people have talked about the overcorrection towards great power competition. I think I would echo that. I would just say in the technology kind of realm, somebody talked about Brian Jenkins. I think it's Chris Costa referenced back to Brian Jenkins. Brian and then Bruce Hoffman used to always say, when I was with them at RAND, they say, you know, terrorist groups are like sharks. They have to keep moving forward, and otherwise they'll die. And I would say that counterterrorism forces are exactly the same. Counterterrorism is about innovation and adaptation. And so you have to keep trying, you have to keep moving forward. And I've talked about sort of 3 technological ways to do that, but then I would now step back in caution and say, don't forget the mundane. The mundane is equally important, and in fact, sometimes the mundane trips us up as much or more than the technological innovation. So that's just my fair warning, I guess.
It's a key reminder to add tools, not subtract as we go along, increase the toolbox. I'd like to give each of you like a minute to wrap up and any additional reflections you want to add on the intersections of tech, terrorism, and counterterrorism. So maybe we'll just go down the line. Don, Kim, Jess, Vidya.
I think the one thing I would stress, if I had to pick one thing to close, would just be that in this environment, with all the different influences of technology and how they intersect with terrorism and counterterrorism, is just the need for greater emphasis on partnerships and creative partnerships from the government side. I think that's something that the government understands, but when it comes to the execution of that, I think it often falls quite short. And so that's an area that I think the government needs, personal view, needs to get a bit more uncomfortable so we can lean forward a bit more in terms of understanding the influences of these technologies and how they're going to, how we can use them and how our adversaries are going to use them as well.
I've been thinking a lot about risk, and I think counterterrorism in a constrained environment ends up being about risk and how we think through risk and where we're willing to take risk and where we're willing not to take risk. And so I guess I'll throw it out there to the expert community to think through that and to articulate it and to debate it, because I see as I look over the horizon, a little bit, I think understanding the risks that we're willing to take and we're not willing to take and articulating those are going to be really important.
Terrorists do something that I call jurisdictional arbitrage. They move to the weakest jurisdiction for a lot of their activities, for their financing activities. So we can employ all the counter-terrorist financing tools we want in our systems, but if our partners aren't doing the same thing, they're wide open for terrorist financing. And I just want to echo what Kim's saying. This should be really informing our risk appetite in the financial sector much more than it is, particularly in a world of great power competition where we don't have really solid counterterrorism cooperation anymore.
One final point, as important as it is to use advanced technology, train our own LLMs, predictive modeling, all of that exciting stuff, to do prevention online, not all solutions actually require advanced technology. The starting point can be, and in many cases is, low tech. It's drawing on what we know works offline and actually adapting that and bringing that into the online space. So sometimes the solution is easier than it looks.
Well, with that said, I think we've stuck to our time. I can see the TSC team giving me the stink eye to wrap it up. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to my panelists and to all of you for being here with us. So thank you.